Welcome. In this lesson, we are going to focus on calling object methods. Let's get started. We've got three learning goals for today. The first is that you can call methods of an object and use them to solve problems. Second is that you can use methods that are void, have parameters, or return a value. And finally, that you can explain the concept of overloaded methods. Remember that objects, which are defined from classes, have variables and they have methods. And typically when an object is created, we interact with it by calling its methods. So in this example, I've created a rectangle object R, and I've said r.printArea. And so what that does is that goes to the object's printArea method, which in this case simply does a system.out.println statement and results in area equal 12 being displayed on the screen. Remember that once we have a class, we can make many objects, and each object maintains its own information. So here I have three rectangle objects, R, R2, and R3, and all three have different lengths and widths. So then when I'm calling the printArea method, it's important that I am able to specify which object I want to call, and I do that by using the object name followed by a dot. So in this case, I want rectangle, the second rectangle's area, so I say r2.printArea, and the result is the method displays 30. Let's suppose I wanted to find the average of my three rectangles. The calculation would be pretty straightforward. I would add the area of each rectangle together and then divide that total by 3. But how would I code it? I'd probably start with some sort of a formula like int average equals something plus something plus something divided by 3, but what would I fill in between the plus signs? Maybe I could try calling my method, right? I've got a method that prints the area, so maybe I would do r.printArea plus r2.printArea plus r3.printArea, but I think there's a problem there. The problem is that printArea only displays the area. It pushes it out on the screen, and it doesn't really give me a value that I can use in my calculation. So I probably need something different here. What we need is a method that produces an answer, and in coding we call these return methods. We start out in the method header specifying the return type, and basically this is declaring our intention for this method to return an int. Somewhere else in the method, usually at the bottom, we're going to have a return statement, and this specifies what value we want to be returned, basically what is the answer. And it's really important that the return type and the return statement match. In other words, if I say I'm going to return an int, I need to return an int. I can't return a string or a double or something else. Typically, there will be code before the return statement, and maybe that code is going to do the calculations. In this case, the method is simple enough that all I have is a return statement. Let's see how we can use our new method to calculate the average area. After creating the three objects, R, R2, and R3, I say int area1 equals r.getArea. So this means that we're going to call the getArea method on our R rectangle. So when we do that, it will go to the method and it will multiply the length and width, which for R is 3 and 4, and it returns that answer of 12. The 12 will get saved in the area1 variable. We do the same thing, but for our R2 rectangle. So this time it will multiply 5 and 6 together and save that answer in area 2. And finally, we do it for our R3 variable. So it will call the method, it will return 7 times 8, which is 56, which will be stored in the area 3 variable. The key difference here versus what we were doing before is that before we were just printing the area, which put the area on the screen but didn't give us the ability to use it later in a calculation. But with the return method, getArea, I'm able to save those results in variables and then use them to calculate my average. Methods that don't return a value are called void methods. The way you make a void method is you just specify the word void for the return type in the method header. So in the last method, we said public int because we wanted the method to return an int value. Here we say public void because we don't want the method to return any value at all. Typically, with void methods, there's not going to be a return statement. And we use void methods when we want the method to do a job, but not necessarily produce a specific answer. Sometimes we need to use parameters to send information to a method when we call it, and we've seen this before when we did our constructor. When we said new rectangle 3, 4, we were saying that we wanted to send the numbers 3 and 4 to the constructor, and then the constructor was able to use those to set the length and width of the rectangle. Now, other methods use parameters too, and we need to be aware of this so that we can call the methods correctly. If you take a look at the scale rectangle method, you will see that it's expecting one parameter, one int, and it uses that int to do a calculation on the length and width. So when we call it, we need to know that so that when we say r.scaleRectangle, we can give it the one number it needs, which will be sent to the method so the method can use it. Time for an understanding check. On the right, you see a class called book. What I'd like you to do is write the code necessary to create a book object, then display the title and pages of the book, and finally display the reading time if you read 2 pages per minute. Pause the video, take some time to think about this and jot down some ideas, and when you're ready, start up again and we'll go over the answer. Let's walk through the solution. So the first thing is we needed to create a book object. So we say book B equals new book. Now, when I made the new book, I also specified the title and the number of pages. And I knew I needed to do that because I took a look at the constructor and saw that the constructor was expecting that information. The next thing we needed to do was display the title and the pages of the book. And we have to recognize that we have a method we can call, a void method called displayBook that will do that for us. So I simply said b.displayBook. The next thing we needed to do was we needed to display the reading time if you read 2 pages per minute. So there's a method for that too, getReadingTime. And it takes one parameter, pages per minute. And so I was able to call that and say b.getReadingTime2, as in 2 pages per minute, and I saved the result in a variable called time, which I printlined at the end. Let's wrap up our discussion of object methods by talking about overloading. Overloading happens when we have 2 methods in a class that have the exact same name. So if you look at the rectangle class, here's my original constructor, public rectangle, and it sets the length and width of the rectangle. And then I've got another method that's called public rectangle that also sets the length and width of the rectangle. But there's a difference. My first constructor has 2 parameters, and my overloaded constructor has just 1. And what this does is it gives us options. We now have 2 different ways we can construct a rectangle object. Take a look. We say first rectangle r equals new rectangle 3, 4. So Java knows, because it sees 2 parameters, to call the first constructor, which will create a rectangle with length 3 and width 4. But then after that, I say rectangle R2 equals new rectangle 5, and I only send 1 parameter. So Java now knows to call my second constructor for this one, and it sets both the length and width to 5. So you don't have to have overloaded methods, but sometimes they're really helpful because they give us options. In this case, 2 different ways to construct a rectangle. Believe it or not, we've actually seen the concept of overloading before and didn't realize it. You might think that there's only one printline method, but there's actually 5 of them. They all have the same name, but each one takes a different parameter. There's a printline that takes an int parameter, and a double, and a boolean, and a char, and even an object. And this is really why overloading is helpful to programmers, because in our minds, all we have to do is think of it as one method, even though behind the scenes, there's 5 different methods being called, and Java is just able to look at the parameter and call the correct method. Let's do a final understanding check. On the screen, I've got some code that creates a rectangle object, and then I call the scale rectangle method twice. What I'd like to know is, after that code executes, what are the dimensions of the rectangle? Pause the video, think about it, and when you're ready, start it up again. After the code executes, the length and width of the rectangle is 12, and it works this way because when we call the scale rectangle method the first time, we send it 2 parameters, so it calls the first version of the method and multiplies the length by 4 and the width by 2. The second time we call scale rectangle, we only send one parameter, so it calls this overloaded one and multiplies both the length and width by 3. Now that you've watched this lesson, you should be able to call the methods of an object and use them to solve problems. You should be able to use void methods, methods that have parameters or return a value, and you should be able to explain the concept of an overloaded method.